Welcome to a short tutorial on camera basics of understanding the exposure triangle. In this presentation, I'll go over ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how each depends on the other given various lighting conditions. It's about adjusting the light using all three settings to get the perfect photo. Much of what you want to do with ISO, aperture, and shutter speed should be determined up front when you're composing a photo, not after the shot's taken. Trying to compensate for underexposure or overexposure will be difficult after the photo's taken, so try to get the perfect shot in the beginning. It's all about exposure. How much light is allowed into the camera? That's determined by the light in your environment. You either have light from a sunny day, or there might be low light in a dark office room. The light from your environment will determine your camera's ISO settings. The ISO is how sensitive the camera is to light. The darker the environment, the more light that's needed, so the ISO number has to be set high to allow more light into the camera. The downside is the image will become grainier as the ISO number increases. As a general rule of thumb, set the ISO as low as possible for the light in your surrounding environment. The light from your environment will determine your camera's shutter speed, how fast the shutter opens and closes. The faster the shutter speed, the less light that's allowed into the sensor. Shutter speed also controls motion. Slower shutter speeds capture motion, where fast shutter speeds freeze motion. And finally, the light from your environment will determine your camera's aperture settings. The aperture opens and closes, allowing more or less light into the camera's sensor. The smaller the aperture opening, the higher the number setting. It's referred to as an f-stop. The larger the aperture opening, the smaller the f-stop number. Higher aperture settings provide images with a full range of focus, like scenery, where low aperture settings have large openings and provide a shallow or low depth of field, where the background is out of focus from the primary subject. The depth of field can be a fun way to exercise your artistic abilities with the camera. With the three of these, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, you have what's known as the exposure triangle. The next question you want to ask yourself is, what do you want to capture? How much light is in the environment? This is the first question you ask yourself before taking a picture. If the camera is set on full auto, then you don't have to think about the exposure, but you just get what the camera gives you. Learning what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are and how they interact with each other will improve your photography skills tremendously and give you more control over your images. The first shot here is a freeze motion. Since there was plenty of light, the ISO could be set low with less sensitivity, and that provides a grain-free image. Something like ISO 100 versus, say, ISO 4000, which would be very grainy. The car was traveling fast, so the shutter speed had to be set high, like 1/1/4000th of a second. This freezes the car while leaving the background a blur, capturing high-speed motion. On the other hand, you can choose to capture light from moving cars. To do this, you need to set the camera on a tripod and slow the shutter speed way down. You only want to capture the moving lights, not the cars. So high or fast shutter speeds freeze motion, and slow shutter speeds capture motion. Shallow depth of field can be seen in this image. The aperture is set small to blur out the background, so the focus is on the beautiful flower. If you were shooting this image on fully automatic, the camera might not have captured as much blur or depth of field. Shooting it in the M or manual mode allows you to set the ISO low, around 100, and then close down the aperture as much as possible to blur out the background. Then set the shutter speed accordingly until the exposure is correct. This image is the result of some exciting photography during a storm. To capture this type of image, you need to set your camera on bulb. That's where you control when the shutter opens and closes. That's right. You can leave it open for 5 minutes if you need to. In this case, you can turn all the lights out around you, click on the button to open the shutter, and wait for the lightning to strike. As soon as it does, click on the button again and close the shutter. To take it a step further, you can leave the shutter open while lightning strikes multiple times, and then close. In this image, it appears that lightning may have struck 4 times, while the shutter was open, or possibly 2 times, one on the left and one on the right. Either way, the result is dramatic. You can actually open the sensor and use the light of the moon to write on an image. Give it a try. So the 2 images on the left are shots taken of normal conditions or events, where the 2 on the right are more artistic photography. So in the top 2, you have your priority is actually shutter speed, and you then can set your aperture and your ISO accordingly to get the proper exposure. In the bottom, the priority is the aperture. So in order to get what I want, the blurred background, I need to work with my aperture. That will give me what I need. And then I'm going to set my shutter speed and ISO accordingly to get the proper exposure. Can you tell which of these images was taken using a fast shutter speed and which was taken using a slow shutter speed? The thought process is like this. I want to capture the motion of the wings, or I want to stop the motion by freezing the wings in place. If capturing movement is my priority, then I want to try for either the highest or slowest shutter speed. High speeds will stop motion and slow speed will capture motion. I would use 1/4 of a second to capture the motion and set the ISO and aperture so I can obtain this slow shutter speed. I'll use 1/4000th of a second to freeze the wings and adjust the ISO and aperture accordingly. On the left here, I have high depth of field where everything is in focus. I can get full focus with a high f-stop and then adjust my ISO and shutter speed accordingly. If I want to blur out the background, I need to close down on my aperture and use a large opening with an f-stop of 1.4. Remember, the higher the number, the smaller the aperture opening, and the less light that's allowed into the sensor. But the more focused the whole image will be. With less light, you can decrease the ISO to say 100 and then have more flexibility with the shutter speed. The image on the right can be obtained by opening the aperture, which will also allow more light in, so the shutter speed can then be adjusted accordingly to get the correct exposure. This is a scene where full focus would be the most desirable outcome, where the scene on the right here is an extreme blur in the background. A tripod may be the best solution for high depth of field shots like this, depending on the environmental lighting conditions. The blurred background emphasizes the subject, and viewers find images like this quite mesmerizing. There will be some exercises at the end where you can practice ISO, shutter speed, and aperture settings so you can learn the relationship they have with each other. So what ISO, f-stop, and aperture would you use in this image? Everything is in focus, so we'll think through the process. There's plenty of light, so a low ISO, maybe 100 for a less grainy image. Since we want everything in focus, we need to use a small aperture opening, which is a large f-stop reading, maybe f28. So the question remains, what shutter speed should we use? Since it's sunny, probably around 1/1000th of a second. You can do what's called bracketing your shots by taking a couple of underexposed and a couple of overexposed images to see which ones you like the best. So let's put the exposure triangle all together. We have the ISO at the bottom, and then we have shutter speed, and then we have aperture. Looking at the ISO, it is the camera's sensitivity to light, and it will increase the brightness of a shot the higher the ISO. So if you're in a well-lit area, you want a low ISO. If you're in a very dark lit area, raising the ISO will provide more overall light, but you will suffer with the graininess of the image. That's why the general rule of thumb is to keep it as low an ISO setting as possible to avoid the high grain. On the shutter speed side, we have blur, motion blur, and then we have freeze or stop motion. We have the bulb setting, which is manually controlled. You open and close it with the click of the button, all the way up to one click of the button at 1/60th of a second. The reason it's in red is because this is the point at which you can start hand holding the camera. Anything below 1/60th of a second needs a tripod. Anything above 1/60th of a second you can hold. Then on the aperture, we have a very small opening with a high number to a very large opening with a small number. Obviously, this allows more light in. The relationship here is that you have high depth of field at low apertures, and you have full range of focus at high apertures. So that's what these images mean within the triangle. The aperture adjusts the amount of light allowed to reach the camera sensor, and the shutter speed adjusts the rate of speed at which the light is allowed to reach the camera sensor. So the environment, the conditions, the lighting conditions in the environment will control your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. For your shutter speed, remember the pictures of the hummingbird with the frozen wings and the car that was frozen in space. It freezes motion, and then you have capturing of motion at slow shutter speeds. You have full focus scenery, and you have depth of field at very small aperture readings. Here are the exercises using ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. What we want to do is set up a coffee cup in an indoor environment and an outdoor environment. We're looking at depth of field. We're going to set the ISO at 100 and a speed of 1/60th of a second and adjust our aperture. And we'll do the same for the others underneath. If you don't want to do each aperture setting, you can do 1.4, 5.6, and 22 in each setup. This is a fun exercise. Set your camera up on a tripod and set it to bulb. Turn all the lights off in a room, and you have a high ISO setting. You have a high ISO setting, and you click the camera to open the shutter, and you have a friend start at the top of the stairs and walk down, and then you click the camera again to close the shutter, and what you should end up with is a very blurred, ghost-like image. Here's some special effects photography. In the top left, you have a Photoshop of one image that's been embedded into another. In the bottom below that you have depth of field, a close-up, and in the middle depth of field and lighting, and below stop motion, and in the top right you have lighting effects, and in the bottom you have more graphic design work that was 2 images put together in Photoshop. So this concludes the tutorial on the exposure triangle. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps improve your photography skills. This is slide 3, and it shows all of the animations on this slide. And if I view the slide notes, that's where I actually put my script on all of my slide notes.